Good afternoon. So, if you're watching this, it's maybe because you care about our forests. And what I've learned recently in studying forests and the public policy and teaching my course on wildfires is that public policy is kind of at odds with our forests. If we want to understand what are the greatest threat to our forest? It's not climate change. It's what we are doing to the forest in terms of logging, etc. So let's get into this. This report I'm going to show you goes back to 2021, which may seem like ancient history, but it's really not. Part of the what I want to convey is that there haven't been any big changes as between administrations. So you had Trump in the 2017 to 2021, you had Biden from 2021 to 2025. Now you have Trump again. Some people are really, creating a lot of drama. And I think, Trump's environmental policies are worse, but it's not like orders of magnitude worse. It's more like more of the same, just a little extra. So let's look at this 2021 report. And let me click on this. So the title of the report is Running Backwards, Logging Provisions in the Infrastructure and Budget Reconciliation Packages Would Worsen the Climate Crisis and Threaten Public Health. This is a report from the John Muir Project, the Center for Sustainable Economy. Chad Hansen is my friend, or at least acquaintance, who is the chief scientist with the John Muir Project. He's based in California. He's one of the real truth tellers today in forest policy. And let me click out of this for just a minute. There are a lot of people who love to hate Chad Hansen because Hansen is one of those people who is doing good work. You would be concerned if people weren't mad about the work that he's doing. The fact that people are mad at Chad Hansen for doing the work that he's doing indicates that he is getting in the way of some powerful interest. He is getting in the way of people who want to make money on our forests, and they're pulling out all the stops. If they can't disagree with your ideas or your reports, then they attack you personally. And maybe someday, real soon, we'll get into one of those articles. But let's just look at the work of Chad Hansen. So it says this report was researched and written. Let me see, I think I need to click on another thing here. This report was researched and written by Chad Hansen, PhD, Executive Director and Principal Scientist of the John Muir Project of Earth Island Institute. Now, going below that is a cover photo down in the bottom half of this. The cover photo attribution is a machine stacks logs. This is from 2015. A machine stacks logs in the Coconino National Forest just outside Falstaff, Arizona, as part of the Four Forests Restoration Initiative. And so I want to point out something in just a minute, but this is from Flagstaff, Arizona, and the title of the thing is For Forest Restoration. And then also the slide after that, I want to point out the back cover image. This we're going to show you is a natural forest regeneration at 10 years post-fire. So after the fire is the forest recovers. So let's look at those two pictures. Here is the picture on the left, on the bottom left, is, this is called forest restoration. Imagine restoring a forest by cutting down all the trees. Imagine restoring a forest by using heavy equipment. I mean, these are massive machines that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars per machine, if not $1 million or more for some of these machines. And, they're massive tonnage, many, many tons per machine. They're compacting the soil and they're cutting down the trees. So the irony is that this heavy equipment is said to be part of forest restoration. This is par for course. This is exactly what we've come to expect from the timber industry and the U.S. Forest Service, with the U.S. Forest Service being part of the timber industry because they make money from timber sales from our national forests. Next slide. This photo was taken, now you see over here, this looks kind of like a degraded forest, but you have to remember that this particular part of the forest was decimated by a high intensity fire only 10 years ago. So this illustrates how the forest can regenerate after a high intensity fire if we will let it. But what the timber industry wants to do is to go in and do post-fire logging. They want to do all this thinning, in anticipation of fires, saying if we just thin this out, then it's going to lower the intensity of the fire. But we don't need to lower the intensity of the fires because forests don't need to be protected from fires. They need to be protected from logging. Reading what I've written here on the right, this photo was taken 10 years after a high intensity wildfire in Sequoia National Forest. That's in California. The idea is that it is regenerating nicely. Forests do not need to be saved from wildfire. It is part of their natural fire regime. Forests are adapted to rebound after fire. Forests are adapted to thrive after a fire. They don't need to be protected from fire. Continuing to read here, post-fire forests exhibit high levels of biodiversity if allowed to regenerate. We need to just say no to post-fire logging, also known as salvage logging. So the idea is that, salvage logging, we need to get in here and save this timber, save these logs. Save them from what? Save them from going through the natural process of decomposing over the course of time. If we allow our dead wood to decompose over the course of time, guess what? You ever seen buzzards or vultures flying around in the sky? They're pretty resilient species. It's like, we've gotten rid of a lot of species, but buzzards are kind of doing pretty well. So they'll be flying around in the sky and they're trying to smell something dead. And eventually they find something dead. They circle and then you find a bunch of them circling the same place. They're going to kind of come down and they're going to eat the dead deer or the dead animal, raccoon, whatever it is. And the idea is that nature has a way of dealing with waste. If an animal dies, you have vultures and other critters, bacteria, even fungi, protozoa, all of that will try to decompose. They'll eat and digest and poop out the dead animal. And it doesn't take that long for a dead animal to decompose. It takes quite a bit longer for a tree to decompose, but it's the same idea. There are organisms in nature that make their living eating dead things, including dead animals, including dead trees. So when the timber industry says we need to do salvage logging, we need to save these logs, save them from what? Save them from the natural process of decomposition. And here's the thing. When things decompose, you have creatures, you have bacteria that are doing the decomposition and they become food for something else. You have buzzards doing the decomposition, eventually they'll become food for something else. As far as wood, you have bacteria and fungi and insects that are doing the work of decomposition. Those bacteria and the fungi and the insects then become food for something else. And the bacteria and the fungi and the insects that make their living decomposing wood are harvesting the nutrients and the energy. Think of how much energy has been stored in a dead log. How much energy has been stored in a tree? The tree captures that sunlight through photosynthesis and takes it and uses it to build its tissues. And so its tissues then have energy. Its tissues have things like cellulose and lignin, which are these complex organic molecules that have a lot of energy. Now, you and I can't go out here and try to chew on a piece of wood. We might be able to get away with some of that, but we can't get away with a lot of that because we cannot digest that wood. But bacteria, fungi, decomposing, wood-boring beetles are examples of insects that take the energy and the nutrients of that wood and use it to live their life, and then eventually transfer that energy to other things. So we just need to push back on this idea that we're saving the forest by taking out the dead logs. We are destroying, or at least degrading, the forest when we take away these dead logs, because those dead logs have all kinds of energy, all kinds of nutrients, and we need to let the natural processes go through their natural processes, and that's what feeds the food web. Now let's get back to the slide presentation. So it says logging. So what I'm doing is I've lifted some quotes from this report from the John Muir Project, and it says logging in the U.S. currently emits at least 723 million metric tons of CO2 annually, which is over 14% of total U.S. greenhouse emissions and is more than the commercial and residential sectors combined. This is to say that there is a whole lot of carbon emissions that comes from logging. And so, the timber industry and the Forest Service have their narrative, and it's a false narrative, I will argue. I'm always arguing that the timber industry and the Forest Service are giving us false narratives. They're giving us pseudoscience. And, they're saying that, we have to get in here and use things like prescribed burning and things like tree thinning to save the forest from wildfire, and this is good for climate change. Somehow, somewhere, they're going to try to make this say that this is good for climate change, or good for addressing climate change. But the logging emits a whole lot of carbon, and these provisions in these infrastructure bills, the Fix Our Forest Act, which is the Trump administration's version of how to save our forest by destroying it. There was a Vietnam Army officer who said we had to destroy the village in order to save it, which is a strange take on the concept of saving something. And similarly, the timber industry and the Forest Service are proposing to constantly go in and thin and burn and thin and burn, and thinning means logging. And so anyway, let's go to the next slide and see what it has to say. Quoting from this report, the infrastructure and reconciliation bills, that's these two pair of bills that came in late 2021 in the Biden administration. So the infrastructure and reconciliation bills, if passed in their current form, would increase CO2 emissions from logging by 48%, pushing emissions from logging well over 1 gigaton per year. So this is, you know, my fellow environmentalists who are, they're typically urban liberals who are strongly identified with the Democratic Party, and they think Trump is just the worst thing ever. Trump is the next Hitler. And I'm not a Trump supporter, I'm not a Trump fan, but methinks they doth protest too much. Or I think the original quote from Hamlet is, she doth protest too much, methinks. But anyway, they're saying that that Trump is fundamentally and inherently worse than Biden. I think Trump might be incrementally worse than Biden, but which is to say worse, but not by much. And so here in 2021, in the Biden administration, you have these scientists saying that logging is going that the provisions in this bill are going to increase emissions from logging by 48%. For one thing, they're greatly expanding the acreage that is mandated to be logged under this bill. So anyway, let's go on and see what they have to say. The logging provisions in the infrastructure and reconciliation bills combined with the new highway construction. So you have the logging provisions in the infrastructure and reconciliation bills combined with the new highway construction provisions in the infrastructure, and the loss of the Clean Energy Performance Program would erase all of the estimated gains in carbon emissions reductions from the emissions reducing clean energy provisions in both bills. Now this is all a mouthful, so I thought I was showing that to you, but here we go. The logging provisions in the infrastructure and reconciliation bills combined with the new highway construction provisions in the infrastructure and the loss of Clean Energy Performance Program would erase all the estimated gains in carbon emissions reductions from the emission reducing clean. So what they're saying is this bill as drafted, they are saying, I don't necessarily agree with all of what they're saying, but they are saying that the Clean Energy Performance Program is going to reduce carbon emissions by a certain amount. That's a whole other topic. I don't really buy it, but work with me here. Let's work with them. Let's assume, for the sake of discussion, that the Clean Energy Performance Program is reducing carbon emissions. That what they're saying, what Hansen and the authors of this report are saying, that the logging provisions and the new highway construction provisions are canceling all of that out. So, the Biden fans, which I'm not, but Biden fans, the mainstream liberal Democrats were always touting the merits and the virtues of the infrastructure bill and the IRA, what was the IRA? The Inflation Reduction Act, which was largely 80% of the Inflation Reduction Act had to do with, it was supposed to be addressing climate change. Now, I don't buy. To me, it's just a pork barrel giveaway for industry. But anyway, let's go on to the next slide. And this infrastructure bill is also a pork barrel giveaway for industry. So let's go on to the next slide and see what they have to say. In fact, the net effect would be an annual increase in CO2 emissions from 80 million metric tons by 2030, taking us farther away from the minimum climate change mitigation goal of 50% emissions reductions of 2005 levels by 2030. So they're just saying that all of this bill is going to increase carbon emissions. And, I kind of have an offbeat view of what climate change is and how to address it. But I'm willing to talk carbon. I don't think climate change is all about carbon, and I don't think carbon is the most important environmental issue. I don't think climate change is the most important environmental issue, but let's talk, assuming for the sake of discussion, if climate change is the most important environmental issue, which some want to make it out to be, and if carbon emissions are the biggest cause of climate change, which some want to make it out to be, then are you going to support this bill? Okay, Biden is your boy, but are you going to support this bill that increases carbon emissions through logging? That is the question. Continuing to read, logging conducted under the guise of thinning emits 3 times more carbon in the atmosphere than wildfire alone. So, what is thinning? I'm sorry, I thought I was showing you that slide. Logging conducted under the guise of thinning emits 3 times more carbon into the atmosphere than wildfire alone. So, what is thinning? So thinning is when you take heavy equipment and you go into, because it's not Paul Bunyan with an axe, and it's not the guy with the chainsaw anymore. It's heavy equipment. So take heavy equipment into the forest and do something called thinning. And what you're doing is you're just cutting down trees. And cutting down trees causes carbon emissions. Why? Several different stages of the process emit carbon. For one thing, part of it, the part that nobody talks about when they talk about, let's say we're talking about biomass energy, which is go in and cut down the trees and then send them to the factory, turn them into wood pellets, ship them to England to burn like coal. This is supposed to be carbon neutral, which it's not. But so that's one thing. You're taking stuff, you're turning it into wood pellets, and you're burning it. That is a source of carbon emissions. Another source of carbon emissions is when you go into the forest with heavy equipment, you cut down trees, only a fraction of what you cut down becomes wood or wood pellets. Most of the rest becomes slash. Slash is limbs and leaves, pine needles, twigs, and branches, which are left on the forest floor to decay. Now, dead wood is good, but excess dead wood, that probably causes some emissions because maybe the forest doesn't have the capacity to bring in the bacteria and the fungi to cause it to, my head kind of swims a little bit. But anyway, let's just say that there are lots of ways in which logging causes carbon emissions, not least of all, if you go in there and you degrade the soil with heavy equipment, you're degrading the soil by removing the trees from the top. The trees, when they were living, they were taking that carbon dioxide from the air, putting into the soil, storing the carbon in the soil, because that's what happens when you take plants and trees. Plants and trees are taking carbon dioxide out of the air and they're turning it into sugars. They're exuding about a third of those sugars through their roots and storing it in the soil when the tree was living. But if you artificially cut down the tree, you're removing nutrients from the forest. When you remove the nutrients, you're degrading the power and the value of the ecosystem to cycle those nutrients, all the things that make up proteins, carbohydrates, and fats, your carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, potassium, phosphorus, iron, manganese, molybdenum, magnesium, all these things, the calcium, all these, I just named some of the top 20 nutrients that are part of the the essential nutrient. When you take a log out of the forest, you're removing those nutrients from the forest. You're degrading the forest. And when you degrade an ecosystem, it emits carbon into the air. One of the many reasons why logging causes carbon emissions. Let's see what's next on our slide. So over 200 scientists conclude that the best available science indicates that thinning and other logging is not a wildfire solution and does not stop wildfires, often making fires burn more intensely. So, one of the main messages that we get from the Forest Service and the timber industry, which are two peas in a pod, they are scratching each other's back. I tell you what, Forest Service, timber industry, two peas in a pod. I like mixing metaphors. So let's just say the two peas in a pod scratching each other's back. Okay, work with me here. But they want you to think that forest thinning is good for the forest. They want you to think that tree thinning is good for forest health. They want you to think that tree thinning is good for preventing wildfires. It's not good for forest health because it's all the heavy equipment, all the removal of nutrients, and it's not good for preventing wildfires because you're coming in, you're degrading the forest, you're causing it to dry out because you're removing all these trees. The trees used to cast shade, now they don't cast shade anymore because they're not there anymore, and so you have more wind coming through the forest. You have the understory, the herbaceous layer and the shrub layer, which did cause a little bit of a wind break. Now those are gone, so you have more wind coming through, more of a capacity to dry out those soils, and as a result you have the soils being dried out by the sun and the wind. This is a formula for making more wildfires, not less. This is a formula for high intensity fire, not low intensity fire. And the high intensity fire is not in and of itself bad for the forest, but if we're going in there pretending to be able to reduce wildfire and we're only making them worse, then we have lost the plot. We are defeating our own purpose. Now let's click on this again. So this is, kind of a screenshot from this report, the infrastructure bill, $400 million in subsidies for biomass and wood pellet facilities, $400 million in general subsidies for logging on public lands and private lands, $50 million specifically to subsidize logging in inaccessible forests. How do you subsidize logging? Well, you for one thing, you build roads. Building logging roads at public expense it's a subsidy for the timber industry, and it's bad for the forests. So, conclusions. The Forest Service and timber industry agenda is bad for forest health, wildfire suppression, and carbon emissions. The worst aspects of forest management, conclusion number 2, the worst aspects of forest management don't change much from one administration to the next. It's mostly bipartisan. So that's all I have for you today. I just, it's like believe half of what you hear, or believe half of what you see and none of what you hear. So I submit to you that, believe virtually nothing that you read in the media or from the Forest Service, because it's, the timber industry is one of the slickest and most resourceful industries in the world. If we think the fossil fuel industry is somehow clever with rhetoric and propaganda, well, they probably are, but the timber industry gives them a run for their money. And the sad thing is that you only have to know about a half a dozen different concepts you only have to understand about half a dozen different concepts to have a good BS detector. And so, tree thinning, if you understand that tree thinning is bad and why it is, if you understand why prescribed burning is way oversold and why that's the case, if you understand how these things work, and if you understand a few things about how the forest functions ecologically, then you can have what Noam Chomsky calls, consider my work a course in intellectual self-defense. Your preventing, if you know enough, then you're not so easily fooled, and you don't have to know a lot of different things. You have to just know a few key things to keep from being fooled by this propaganda, which is in all of your favorite, most prestigious, most famous media outlets: New York Times, NPR, MSNBC, CNN, Washington Post. They are all they're just PR arms of the timber industry. Insofar as they report on forest health, they're the timber industry has outsourced its public relations to all of these media assets. And so anyway, it's a sad state of affairs, but the fun thing is that when you know a thing or two, you can, stand against the propaganda. Thanks so much for joining me.